from?
India.
India.
China.
China.
India.
China.
What if the bustling dim sum restaurant around the corner was not only serving dumplings, but also concealing narcotics forged passports and a shadow network tied to Beijing? That shocking scenario became reality in Missouri when federal agents stormed the Golden Apple Buffet in St. Peter's. The early morning raid, part of what officials dubbed Operation Silent Dragon, marked the opening act of Donald Trump's most aggressive immigration crackdown to date. It was not a routine inspection. Inside kitchens, agents uncovered far more than undocumented workers. Hidden in plain sight were forged passports, counterfeit visas, and narcotics bricks disguised as soy sauce shipments, evidence of a sprawling smuggling operation stretching from Houston to China. The scale stunned even hardened investigators. According to Department of Homeland Security officials, the raid was part of a broader campaign that has already led to the arrest of over 100 Chinese nationals in just the first half of 2025. This represented a tenfold increase compared to the same period in the previous year, a surge that speaks to the intensity of Trump's enforcement push. For years, American intelligence had tracked Chinese organized crime groups operating within immigrant communities, but enforcement had often lagged. Under the new administration, the approach shifted. Raids became swifter, more coordinated, and far more public. What made the Missouri operation stand out was not just the discovery of illegal labor practices, but the revelation that these restaurants doubled as nodes in a transnational criminal web. Stashed under floorboards and hidden inside storage rooms, agents found documents so sophisticated that even state DMVs and banks had previously failed to detect them. These were not isolated cases. Federal prosecutors later revealed that similar setups were discovered across the country, from Los Angeles nightclubs to New York warehouses. This convergence of immigration violations and cartel-level narcotics trafficking raised pressing national security concerns. The Drug Enforcement Administration reported that Chinese and Mexican rings had increasingly taken over America's illegal marijuana trade, using small businesses as cover to funnel profits. But more alarming was the evidence of fentanyl stashes, the same synthetic opioid fueling record overdose deaths across the United States. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than 100,000 Americans lost their lives to overdoses in the past year, with fentanyl responsible for the majority. The Missouri raid underscored how deeply foreign networks were tied into this domestic crisis. Western analysts warned that the implications extend beyond drugs. The use of ordinary restaurants as criminal fronts reveals a strategy of camouflage, noted Dr. Sarah Kendall, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, in a recent Reuters interview. These operations are designed to blend into everyday American life, making detection extraordinarily difficult. It's not simply an immigration problem, it's an intelligence and counterterrorism issue. The timing of these revelations is critical. As the war in Ukraine grinds into its fourth year and Russia leans more heavily on partnerships with China, the United States finds itself confronting simultaneous threats. NATO intelligence chiefs have cautioned that hybrid tactics, from cyber intrusions to criminal infiltration, could weaken Western societies from within. The Missouri raids, while seemingly local, feed directly into this broader strategic picture. If hostile states exploit diaspora businesses to fund narcotics and gather intelligence, the risk to American resilience is profound. The Trump administration has been explicit in framing these raids as both a domestic law enforcement and a national defense measure. In speeches this summer, the president emphasized that illegal networks smuggling narcotics and forging documents not only fuel crime, but also provide cover for espionage and technology theft. That warning is not unfounded. In August, federal prosecutors indicted 2 Chinese nationals for attempting to smuggle radiation-hardened microchips used in satellites technology with obvious military applications. Linking visa fraud cases to such espionage attempts adds urgency to ICE's mission. Yet the public reaction remains divided. For some, the images of workers zip-tied and loaded into vans recall a darker chapter of American immigration enforcement, prompting criticism from human rights groups and Chinese-American community leaders. They argue that mass raids risk casting suspicion over entire communities and may destroy the livelihoods of innocent families. For others, the sight of federal agents pulling fentanyl bricks from beneath a restaurant floorboard is a reminder that the cost of inaction is measured in American lives lost to overdoses. From an older analyst's perspective, what stands out most is the evolution of threat perception. 2 decades ago, immigration enforcement was largely framed in terms of labor law and border control. Today, the Missouri raids illustrate how deeply entwined migration, organized crime, and geopolitical rivalry have become. It is no longer possible to treat these as separate issues. When Chinese-owned businesses in America are found laundering millions and smuggling dual-use technology, the line between law enforcement and national defense dissolves. This raises a critical question for the audience. Are these raids primarily about protecting American neighborhoods from drugs and forged documents, or are they the front line in a much larger contest with China and other adversaries? How deep does the shadow economy run when restaurants and suburban homes become extensions of a global criminal web? That was the question investigators faced as Operation Silent Dragon expanded. The Missouri raids peeled back a layer of ordinary life to expose an intricate network beneath the surface, one that relied on sophisticated forgeries, human smuggling, and financial laundering to sustain itself. At first glance, the homes linked to the Golden Apple Buffet in St. Peter's seemed like typical suburban properties. Neighbors recalled vans dropping off workers daily, sometimes as many as 20 people packed into a single residence. But federal agents soon revealed that these were not just crowded living arrangements. They were staging grounds for a shadow system that had perfected the art of concealment. Inside, authorities found evidence of a forgery operation so advanced that fake IDs and driver's licenses consistently slipped past state authorities. Some observers described it as a shadow DMV quietly operating across multiple states. This discovery stunned many. According to federal filings, more than 20,000 fake licenses from Hong Kong and mainland China had already been seized by mid-2025. These documents weren't just for undocumented restaurant workers. They facilitated labor trafficking, financial fraud, and even access to restricted facilities. Experts interviewed by Jane's Defense Weekly warned that such networks can be exploited by hostile states to infiltrate sensitive industries or move illicit funds across borders undetected. The overlap between criminal enterprise and national security risk grew clearer as the investigation widened. Federal officials revealed that the restaurants acted as hubs not only for counterfeit documents, but also for laundering millions of dollars each month through underground banks. These banks, often charging service fees of 2 to 4%, handled transactions worth hundreds of millions. What looked like routine restaurant cash flow in Missouri could in fact be funding drug shipments in Los Angeles or construction projects in New York. It is worth noting that these tactics are not new. For decades, organized crime groups from the Sicilian Mafia to Latin American cartels have used small businesses as covers. What sets the current wave apart is the combination of globalized supply chains, digital banking, and geopolitical rivalry. When networks stretch from Beijing to Houston and exploit both legitimate and underground economies, they become more resilient than past cartels, commented former FBI counterintelligence officer Robert Lasky in an interview with The Guardian. This isn't just about making money, it's about influence, reach, and long-term strategic positioning. The connection to narcotics further complicates the picture. The DEA has confirmed that Chinese and Mexican groups increasingly dominate America's illegal marijuana industry, filling the vacuum left by fragmented local growers. Yet the Missouri case also tied these operations to fentanyl distribution, a far deadlier trade. In one raid, agents discovered bricks of fentanyl hidden beneath kitchen tiles, packed in cartons meant to resemble soy sauce shipments. Given that fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin and requires only a few milligrams to cause death, the presence of such caches inside ordinary restaurants alarmed public health officials. By mid-2025, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had reported overdose deaths topping 100,000 annually, with fentanyl implicated in more than 2/3 of those fatalities. The Missouri raids underscored how foreign networks exploited America's own vulnerabilities, its demand for cheap labor, its porous oversight of small businesses, and its fragmented drug enforcement landscape. For NATO allies, the implications are strategic as well as social. European agencies, particularly in Germany and the Netherlands, have raised alarms about Chinese organized crime infiltrating their own immigrant communities, often using similar tactics of counterfeit documentation and underground financial flows. Reports from DW highlighted how some of these networks have also laundered funds into real estate and technology sectors, blurring the line between criminal finance and strategic economic influence. What America experiences through ICE raids in Missouri, Europe, sees in its own port cities and financial hubs. The political impact in Washington has been swift. Trump administration officials have framed these raids as a vindication of their hardline approach. Homeland Security leaders argue that failing to dismantle such networks would allow cartels and foreign intelligence services to strengthen their foothold. Critics, however, caution that aggressive enforcement risks sweeping up individuals who are not criminal actors but desperate laborers caught in the machinery of global smuggling. This debate has intensified as deportation flights increase, with weekly images of detainees loaded onto planes bound for Beijing. From the vantage point of a seasoned analyst, the Missouri raids symbolize a shift from tactical to systemic confrontation. It is no longer about isolated cases of visa overstays or counterfeit IDs. The evidence points to an organized infrastructure designed to sustain itself indefinitely. That infrastructure, spanning restaurants, suburban homes, nightclubs, and financial conduits, demands a response that goes beyond local police action. It requires coordination between federal agencies, intelligence services, and international partners. This raises another critical question for the audience. If America dismantles these networks in one city, how quickly can they regenerate elsewhere? And what does that mean for national resilience in the face of adversaries who exploit globalization itself? Could the karaoke bar down the street or the massage parlor on the corner be more than what they seem, gateways into a hidden world of human trafficking, narcotics pipelines, and foreign influence? As Operation Silent Dragon widened, investigators discovered that the network stretched well beyond dim sum buffets. Federal agents traced smuggling routes into nightlife economies, where entertainment venues became fronts for syndicates that exploited workers and laundered money at industrial scale. The findings were stark. In Los Angeles, Homeland Security agents raided a series of unlicensed clubs and karaoke bars, detaining 36 Chinese and Taiwanese nationals. Many were undocumented, shuttled daily from crowded residential homes owned by shell companies, their wages kept deliberately below minimum. Their dependence on smugglers created a cycle of debt bondage. Workers could not leave, trapped by fear of both law enforcement and the criminal bosses who controlled their passage into the United States. Investigators described it as modern slavery hidden behind neon signs and cash-only transactions. This pattern was not unique to California. Across the country, massage parlors, strip clubs, and nightlife hubs emerged as extensions of the same shadow economy uncovered in Missouri. Agents reported that workers were frequently rotated between states to avoid detection, while profits were funneled through underground banking systems that moved millions monthly. As one ICE officer told Reuters, the clubs and parlors are just the storefronts. The real machinery is the financial network that keeps them alive. The drug trade was the bloodline running through these operations. According to DEA assessments, Chinese and Mexican groups had begun coordinating trafficking routes, leveraging each other's infrastructure. Mexican cartels provided established smuggling corridors, while Chinese syndicates offered logistics, money laundering, and chemical precursors for synthetic drugs. This alliance gave both sides resilience against U.S. enforcement. Jane's Defense Weekly reported that by mid-2025, as much as 70% of illicit fentanyl precursors seized in the Western Hemisphere originated from Chinese suppliers, often routed through front businesses in America. Labor exploitation added another layer. Beyond nightlife, Chinese and Mexican syndicates infiltrated construction sites, agricultural operations, and even logistics warehouses. Workers recruited with false promises of legal employment were instead trapped in endless cycles of debt. This exploitation created what The Guardian recently called a hidden workforce fueling America's underworld economy. While the public saw raids on restaurants and clubs, analysts understood the broader structure, a workforce sustaining profits while remaining invisible to regulatory systems. From a geopolitical perspective, the expansion into nightlife and labor exploitation had strategic consequences. NATO security briefings in Brussels warned that such networks could be used as cover for intelligence gathering. A nightclub in Los Angeles or a construction site in New York provided more than revenue. They offered opportunities for surveillance recruitment and infiltration. Western experts compared it to Cold War-era tactics, where seemingly benign institutions doubled as platforms for espionage. Today, however, globalization and digital finance magnify the scale and speed of such operations. The Trump administration seized upon these revelations as validation for intensifying enforcement. In speeches, officials drew direct links between organized crime, narcotics deaths, and national security threats. Critics countered that equating undocumented laborers with spies risked conflating very different issues, sowing fear within immigrant communities. Yet the overlap between narcotics trafficking and intelligence-linked networks was undeniable. In one notable case, federal investigators traced cash flows from a Los Angeles nightclub to accounts accounts tied to Chinese state-linked entities, blurring the line between organized crime and geopolitical maneuvering. From the perspective of a seasoned analyst, this represented a dangerous evolution. 2 decades ago, law enforcement viewed nightlife fronts primarily as hubs for money laundering and local vice. By 2025, the same fronts were integrated into a global system that fueled the fentanyl crisis, exploited vulnerable workers, and in some cases facilitated espionage. The distinction between criminal profit and strategic subversion had eroded. The consequences for U.S. communities were immediate. In Chinatowns from San Francisco to New York, businesses reported revenue declines of up to 50% as customers avoided areas associated with raids. Meanwhile, advocacy groups warned of growing mistrust between immigrant communities and law enforcement, making cooperation in genuine countercrime operations more difficult. The dual reality that many workers were victims while their employers, tied into global syndicates, created a dilemma with no easy resolution. Which leads to a pressing question for the audience. As US authorities target these interconnected networks, how can the nation distinguish between vulnerable workers in need of protection and syndicates exploiting them for profit and power? What happens when a raid aimed at undocumented labor suddenly uncovers weapons of intelligence warfare? That is exactly what Operation Silent Dragon exposed as investigators shifted from narcotics busts to counterintelligence cases. What began with fake passports and fentanyl stashes in Missouri kitchens escalated into the seizure of sensitive microchips and allegations of espionage linked directly to Beijing. Federal prosecutors announced in August 2025 that 2 Chinese nationals had been indicted for attempting to smuggle radiation-hardened microcrystals materials critical for satellites and missile systems. These are not commodities one finds in street markets. They are dual-use technologies sought after by defense industries worldwide, and their export is tightly controlled. The implication was staggering. Restaurants once thought to be modest immigrant businesses were doubling as conduits for the illegal transfer of US military-grade technology. This revelation transformed the political debate. Under President Trump, ICE raids were already framed as part of a broader struggle against foreign criminal infiltration. Now the evidence suggested a direct overlap with national security threats. Homeland Security officials compared the cases to Cold War espionage, where everyday storefronts became tools of state influence. It is no longer just about labor violations or narcotics, warned Assistant Attorney General Marcus Farrell in a BBC interview. These networks can and do serve as extensions of foreign intelligence operations. The intelligence dimension deepened when additional cases surfaced. In one, Chinese national Yunhai Li was charged with theft of U.S. medical trade secrets and falsifying government records. In another, prosecutors revealed evidence of Chinese state police outposts operating in American cities, intimidating dissidents and gathering information. By late 2024, such overseas police stations had already been documented in Europe, and their presence in the United States only confirmed that the tactic was global. For analysts, this linkage between narcotics and espionage is critical. It illustrates a hybrid threat environment in which adversaries do not draw clear lines between criminal profit and state objectives. The same underground banks laundering fentanyl money could be moving funds for intelligence activities. The same forged passports enabling undocumented labor could be used by operatives seeking to penetrate sensitive sectors. This convergence is what NATO security chiefs now describe as gray zone tactics operations that exploit ambiguity, stay below the threshold of open conflict, but steadily erode Western resilience. Strategically, the stakes extend well beyond Missouri. In the Indo-Pacific, US and Chinese navies continue their tense maneuvers, particularly in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. Meanwhile, Russia's war in Ukraine has entered a grinding phase, with Moscow relying more heavily on Chinese support. Western experts see a pattern: adversaries use conventional military pressure abroad, while simultaneously destabilizing societies at home through organized crime, cyber operations, and intelligence fronts. The Missouri raids viewed through this lens are not isolated domestic affairs, but part of a global contest for advantage. The discovery of fentanyl caches alongside advanced microchips added urgency to this assessment. According to Defense News, fentanyl seizures in the US reached record highs in mid-2025, with enough synthetic opioids confiscated to kill the population several times over. At the same time, the Commerce Department has tightened restrictions on exporting AI-related semiconductors, warning that technology leakage undermines America's edge in defense and innovation. Finding both drugs and defense-grade chips in the same investigative orbit highlights the complexity of 21st century threats. From the standpoint of an older analyst, this convergence is the defining shift of our era. 2 decades ago, immigration raids would not have been linked to espionage. They were seen through the lens of labor enforcement and border control. Today, they expose the blurred boundaries between organized crime narcotics and state-sponsored intelligence. The United States is confronting adversaries who weaponize criminal networks as much as missile systems. Public reaction has reflected this tension. Some Americans view the revelations as proof that strict enforcement is essential to protect national security. Others worry about the broader impact on immigrant communities who fear being collectively cast as suspect. In Chinatowns across the country, businesses report losses, employees vanish, and families retreat further into silence. Critics argue this atmosphere risks pushing vulnerable people away from cooperation with law enforcement, ultimately benefiting the very networks authorities seek to dismantle. The strategic impact on NATO and Western allies cannot be overlooked. European governments, particularly Germany and the UK, have echoed US warnings about Chinese technology theft. German counterintelligence officials told DW that attempts to acquire dual-use technology through front companies and immigrant networks have increased significantly since 2023. NATO has since called for greater intelligence sharing between allies to identify and neutralize such gray zone threats before they escalate. Which brings us to the central dilemma: if raids now expose both narcotics pipelines and espionage rings, can US authorities adapt their strategy fast enough to address threats that cross every boundary, criminal, economic, and geopolitical at once? What happens when the front line of America's immigration crackdown collides with the everyday life of Chinese American communities? As Operation Silent Dragon gained momentum, the fallout spread from Missouri kitchens and Los Angeles nightclubs to entire neighborhoods across the country. The raids revealed criminal networks, but they also left communities paralyzed by fear, shuttered businesses, and a storm of geopolitical backlash. In Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, Chinese restaurants reported revenue losses of up to 50% by mid-2025. Customers avoided establishments near raid sites, worried about sudden arrests or police presence. Even businesses unconnected to smuggling operations felt the shockwaves. According to The Guardian, dozens of restaurants in California's Chinatowns closed permanently after employees vanished or supply chains collapsed. The image of white vans and zip-tied workers became a deterrent to ordinary diners, devastating livelihoods. Meanwhile, deportation flights intensified. In Dallas, ICE reported the removal of 122 individuals in a single week, many described as high risk. Images of busloads of detainees marching onto planes bound for Beijing went viral. For some Americans, it was justice served, especially as officials confirmed that certain passengers were convicted of murder, bribery, or drug trafficking. For others, the scenes resembled collective punishment, lumping vulnerable migrants together with hardened criminals. The geopolitical reaction was swift. Beijing accused Washington of discrimination, claiming the raids unfairly targeted Chinese nationals and inflamed anti-Asian sentiment. Chinese state media blasted Trump's policies as an attempt to vilify an entire diaspora. At the same time, US prosecutors doubled down, arguing that these operations exposed national security threats that could not be ignored. We cannot treat narcotics pipelines and espionage networks as benign immigration issues, declared Homeland Security Secretary James Whitfield in a statement carried by Reuters. The strategic consequences rippled into global politics. US-China relations, already strained by tensions over Taiwan and South China Sea naval clashes, soured further. Analysts noted that Beijing used the raids as propaganda to frame Washington as hostile toward Chinese people abroad, strengthening its domestic narrative of foreign persecution. In Europe, governments observed the fallout with caution. German officials told DW they had launched their own investigations into Chinese-owned nightclubs and real estate firms after the Missouri Revolution, wary of similar infiltration in their own cities. Domestically, the raids sparked a fierce debate. Immigration advocates argued that indiscriminate crackdowns destroyed trust between law enforcement and immigrant communities, making cooperation against genuine criminal syndicates harder. Civil rights groups warned that blanket suspicion could fuel xenophobia. Yet supporters of the Trump administration countered with grim statistics: more than 100,000 overdose deaths annually, with fentanyl smuggled through networks linked to Chinese syndicates responsible for the majority. If communities are afraid, it is because criminal actors have hijacked them, not because enforcement is happening, said DEA spokesperson Daniel Murray to BBC News. From the seasoned analyst's vantage point, the duality is unavoidable. The US must dismantle networks that smuggle narcotics, launder millions, and siphon sensitive technology. But broad enforcement risks alienating communities whose cooperation is essential to intelligence gathering and criminal prosecution. In effect, the United States faces a paradox in protecting its borders and national security. It may fracture the very social cohesion required to maintain long-term resilience. At the NATO level, the raids carry lessons as well. Allies watching the US crackdown are grappling with similar challenges. In London, authorities have uncovered underground Chinese gambling operations tied to trafficking. In Paris, investigators found that certain massage parlors were fronts for money laundering. The Missouri raids serve as a warning. Organized crime can entrench itself in everyday businesses across the West, and without decisive action, it becomes a shadow economy with geopolitical consequences. For immigrant communities, however, the fear is deeply personal. Advocacy groups reported that families withdrew children from schools near raid zones, while others avoided hospitals for fear of being questioned. Social workers described neighborhoods living in silence, unwilling to report crimes even when victimized. The chilling effect, they warned, was allowing genuine criminal actors to operate with less scrutiny. This leaves Americans with a difficult question. As deportation flights intensify and community fear spreads, is the US strengthening national security or risking a deeper divide that adversaries like Beijing could exploit? Is America defending its borders with precision, or is it risking collateral damage that could fracture entire communities? By late 2025, Operation Silent Dragon had blurred the line between immigration enforcement and counterintelligence, forcing the United States to confront a paradox at the heart of its national security strategy. The scale of the crackdown was undeniable. In just 6 months, ICE reported more than 100 Chinese nationals arrested in Missouri alone, while nationwide operations stretched from coast to coast. The raids dismantled networks that laundered millions each month, trafficked fentanyl disguised as soy sauce shipments, and attempted to smuggle dual-use microchips into China. Each case reinforced the administration's claim that immigration enforcement was no longer a question of labor, but of survival in a world of hybrid threats. Supporters of President Trump's approach point to measurable outcomes. Drug seizures reached record highs, with the DEA announcing in July 2025 that more fentanyl had been intercepted in the first half of the year than in any full year prior. Prosecutors highlighted espionage indictments, including attempts to export artificial intelligence-related microchips worth tens of millions of dollars. These figures underscore the scale of the challenge and the necessity in the administration's eyes of aggressive enforcement. Yet the human and political costs weigh heavily. Chinatowns across America saw closures, job losses, and declining trust in law enforcement. Families lived in fear of deportation even when not connected to criminal syndicates. Civil liberties advocates warned that indiscriminate raids created an environment where communities were punished collectively for the actions of organized crime. Critics in Congress demanded oversight, questioning whether ICE's methods respected constitutional protections. Strategically, the dilemma extends far beyond US borders. NATO allies already grappling with Russian disinformation and Iranian proxy attacks in the Middle East recognize that criminal networks tied to hostile states represent a new front in the contest for Western security. A report from DW in September 2025 emphasized that Chinese syndicates in Europe were laundering money through real estate and logistics companies, mirroring patterns uncovered in Missouri. The alliance faces a common challenge, defending societies not only from tanks and missiles, but also from narcotics, financial subversion, and espionage hidden within civilian life. Western experts remain divided on the long-term consequences. Some argue that the raids have weakened syndicates and disrupted their operations. Others caution that dismantled networks often regenerate quickly, especially when fueled by international demand and state-level protection abroad. Organized crime is adaptive, explained Professor David Allen of King's College London to The Guardian. When you strike one hub, another emerges. The deeper question is whether the West can build resilience without alienating the very communities it needs as partners. From the perspective of a seasoned analyst, the defining lesson of Operation Silent Dragon is that the United States can no longer separate domestic law enforcement from global strategy. Narcotics seizures, forgery rings, and espionage cases are not isolated phenomena. They are threads in a single tapestry of hybrid threats. Addressing them requires not only aggressive enforcement, but also diplomatic engagement, intelligence sharing, and community trust building. Failure on any of these fronts risks turning tactical victories into strategic setbacks. By autumn 2025, the public debate had hardened into two opposing narratives. For one side, America was finally defending itself, dismantling dangerous networks that endangered lives and undermined sovereignty. For the other, the raids represented an overreach that risked collective punishment and deepened social divides. Both views carried truth, and therein lay the nation's dilemma. The ultimate question now facing America is this: can the United States strike the balance between national security and civil cohesion, dismantling criminal networks without alienating the communities caught in the crossfire? Or will the campaign against shadow economies spiral into a broader conflict that adversaries like Beijing are waiting to exploit? Operation Silent Dragon began with raids on Missouri restaurants, but quickly expanded into a nationwide campaign exposing visa fraud, narcotics caches, and transnational smuggling networks. Federal agents uncovered counterfeit documents, fentanyl stashes, and even attempts to smuggle radiation-hardened microchips materials with direct military applications. What began as immigration enforcement escalated into counterintelligence, linking everyday businesses to espionage and organized crime tied to China and Mexico. The raids disrupted syndicates moving millions through underground banks and exploiting undocumented workers through debt bondage. Nightclubs, massage parlors, and construction sites emerged as additional fronts revealing a shadow economy hidden inside American life. While drug seizures and espionage indictments validated Trump's aggressive approach, the fallout in Chinese-American communities was severe. Businesses closed, families lived in fear, and Beijing denounced the raids as discriminatory, straining already tense US-China relations. Strategically, the raids underscored the convergence of crime, narcotics, and espionage in 21st century security threats. NATO allies recognized similar patterns in Europe, highlighting the global scope of the challenge. The United States now faces a dilemma: how to dismantle dangerous networks without fracturing community trust, a balance that will shape both domestic stability and America's standing in its geopolitical contest with China.